When contractor Mike Torres broke through that basement wall on a cold Tuesday morning in Pugbend, he expected to find old pipes, maybe some rotted wood, perhaps a nest of rats. What he found instead was a human skull staring back at him through the dust, still wearing fragments of a veil. The Halloway house had stood on Maple Street for over a century, a hulking Victorian mansion that everyone in town knew but nobody really talked about. 3 stories of peeling grey paint, turrets that leaned slightly to the left, windows that reflected nothing but darkness, even on the brightest summer days. Kids crossed to the other side of the street when they walked past it. Real estate agents quietly steered potential buyers toward literally any other property in Pugbend. Mike had taken the restoration job because he needed the money. His daughter's college tuition wasn't going to pay itself, and the current owner, some distant Halloway cousin from California who'd inherited the place and never even visited, was paying triple the usual rate. All Mike had to do was make the structure sound enough to sell. Simple enough, right? The basement had always felt wrong. Mike noticed it the first day, that heaviness in the air, the way sound seemed to die instead of echo. The walls down there were thick, impossibly thick for a residential basement. Some sections measured nearly 3 feet deep, far more than any structural need could justify. When he'd mentioned it to his partner Carlos, the guy had just shrugged. Old houses were weird, he'd said. People back then built things different. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling. He'd been in construction for 20 years, worked on dozens of historic homes across upstate New York. This was different. The way certain walls had been reinforced, plastered over multiple times, the odd distribution of support beams that seemed designed to hide something rather than hold anything up. And then there were the smells. Some sections of the basement carried this faint, sickly, sweet odor that no amount of bleach could quite eliminate. Before continuing, check, right now, if you're subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see if there's someone from my city here that Tuesday morning Mike was alone. Carlos had called in sick, and the owner had made it clear he wanted the job done fast. Mike set up his work light, pulled on his dust mask, and started removing the plaster from what he'd marked as wall section B7. The eastern corner of the basement behind what used to be a coal storage area. The demolition went smoothly at first. Standard horsehair plaster over brick, exactly what he expected. Then his hammer punched through into nothing, not just empty space, a void, a hollow that shouldn't exist. Mike pulled away more plaster, working faster now, that wrongness in his gut growing into something closer to dread. The hole grew larger, 2 feet wide, 3 feet. And then his work light caught something white inside the darkness. Too white, too smooth, bone. The skull was small, delicate. Female, Mike thought, though he was no expert. It sat atop a pile of fabric, rotted and stained, but still recognizable as cloth. Expensive cloth, the kind women wore for special occasions. Around the skull's crown, tangled in what might have been hair once, was a circlet of fake flowers. A bridal veil, dissolved by time but still clinging to its purpose. Mike stumbled backward, his hammer clattering to the concrete floor. His hand shook as he pulled out his phone, fingers fumbling the emergency call 3 times before he managed to dial. The operator's voice sounded distant, dreamlike, as Mike tried to explain what he'd found. A body in the wall, not recently deceased, he managed to clarify. Old, very old. While he waited for the police, Mike couldn't stop staring at that hole in the wall, the way the bricks had been laid. The precision of the work. Someone had built that cavity deliberately, carefully, sealed it from the outside with the same craftsmanship they'd used to build the rest of the house, and inside they'd left a woman to die. The first police car arrived within 15 minutes. Officer Sarah Chen, a young woman Mike recognized from around town, stepped carefully down the basement stairs, her flashlight sweeping the space. She approached the wall slowly, professionally, but Mike saw her face go pale when the light caught the skull. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. More officers arrived, then detectives. By noon, the basement was crowded with official personnel, photographers, someone from the medical examiner's office. They worked around Mike, who sat on the bottom step in a daze, watching them document and measure and carefully extract the remains from their tomb. Detective Raymond Park, a stocky man in his 50s with kind eyes that had seen too much, eventually sat down next to Mike. "You found it," he said. Not a question. Mike nodded. "Tell me about the wall. What made you decide to open this particular section?" So Mike explained. The structural survey, the odd thickness, the way this whole corner of the basement seemed designed to waste space. Park listened, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. How long had Mike been working here? Had he found anything else unusual? Had anyone else been in the basement? "The thing is," Mike said, his voice still shaky, "I think there might be more." Park looked at him sharply. "More bodies? More walls? Look around, detective. Look at how this basement is laid out. All these thick sections, these weird angles. I thought it was just bad planning, but now—" Mike trailed off, gesturing at the crime scene tech still working behind them. "Now I'm thinking it was very good planning, just not for anything normal." Park stood up, his eyes scanning the basement with new attention. Mike could see him doing the math, measuring spaces in his head. After a long moment, the detective pulled out his radio. "I need a full forensic architecture team down here," he said, "and someone get me the building permits for this address going back to the 1800s, every single one." The medical examiner, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Patricia Solis, approached them, wiping dust from her hands. "We've got the remains out," she reported. "Female, approximately 20 to 30 years old at time of death. Based on clothing and the style of that veil, I'd estimate sometime in the early 40s, but that's preliminary. We'll know more after analysis." "Cause of death?" Park asked. Dr. Solis's face was grim. "Judging by the position of the body and the complete lack of trauma to the bones, I'd say she was alive when she was sealed in. The cavity was only about 4 feet deep, maybe 7 feet tall, less than 2 feet wide, barely enough room to stand or crouch, no ventilation, no light. The cause of death was almost certainly suffocation, dehydration, or both." Mike felt his stomach turn. He'd been working inches away from this woman's tomb for 3 days, drilling holes, measuring spaces, completely unaware that someone's daughter, someone's wife, had died screaming in the dark right behind the wall. "How long would it have taken," he heard himself ask, "for her to, you know?" Dr. Solis looked at him with sympathy. "In a sealed space that small? 3, maybe 4 days. Could have been as long as a week if she was very unlucky." The basement fell silent, except for the hum of work lights and the quiet conversations of the crime scene team. Mike thought about those 4 days. The darkness, the desperate hope that someone would hear her screaming, pounding on the bricks. The slow understanding that nobody was coming, the final moments when the air ran out. "We need to check every wall in this house," Park said quietly. "Every single one." By evening, the Halloway house had become a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded the property. News vans were setting up on Maple Street. Mike watched from his truck as more equipment was brought in. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, structural engineers. The investigation was just beginning. His phone buzzed, a text from the owner in California. "What's happening? I'm seeing news about my property. Call me immediately." Mike didn't call. He just sat there, watching the old house as lights blazed in every window for probably the first time in decades. Somewhere in there, sealed behind plaster and brick and wallpaper and paint, were the answers to questions nobody in Pugbend had thought to ask. How many Halloway wives had run away over the years? How many had killed themselves despite leaving no note, no body? How many were still in the walls? By the end of the first week, they'd found 3 more. The second body turned up in the north wall of what used to be the master bedroom. The forensic team had been using ground-penetrating radar looking for anomalies in the wall structure when they detected a cavity similar to the one in the basement. This tomb was smaller, crueler. The woman had been sealed into a space barely 3 feet tall, forcing her to remain in a permanent crouch. The remains of a nightgown clung to the bones. A wedding ring was still on her finger. Doctor Solis estimated she'd died sometime in the late 20s based on the style of the ring and fabric remnants. The positioning of the skeletal hands suggested she'd tried to claw her way out. Deep scratches marred the interior bricks, and several of her finger bones were broken. Detective Parks stood in the bedroom, staring at the hole in the wall, his face a mask of controlled rage. "She fought," he said quietly. "She fought hard." Sarah Chen, who'd been promoted to lead investigator on the case given her initial response, looked pale but determined. "The bedroom makes sense in a sick way," she said. "Maximum psychological torture. The husband would have slept on the other side of this wall, might have even heard her in those first hours." "Might have?" Park's voice was sharp. "Probably did hear her," Sarah corrected herself. "Probably listened." The third body was found in the dining room, sealed behind what had once been an ornate built-in china cabinet. This victim was different. The cavity was larger, almost comfortable by comparison to the others. There was evidence of food wrappers, a bucket that had served as a toilet, even a thin blanket. The woman had survived longer in her prison, possibly weeks. "Look at this," one of the forensic techs called out, carefully extracting a small book from the remains. A diary, its pages brittle and water-damaged, but still partially readable. Sarah took it with gloved hands, carefully opening to a random page. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. November 17th. "He brings water twice a day now. Says if I'm quiet, if I learn to be a proper wife, he'll let me out. I believe him. I have to believe him. The darkness is so complete, I can't tell if my eyes are open or closed anymore." Sarah flipped ahead, her throat tight. November 28th. "No water yesterday. Or today, I think it's day." I screamed until my voice broke. "The wall is so thick, nobody can hear me. I don't think he's coming back. I don't think—" The entry ended there, the final word trailing off into an illegible scrawl. "Jesus Christ," Park muttered, reading over her shoulder. "He kept her alive deliberately, fed her just enough to extend the suffering." Dr. Solis, examining the remains, confirmed it. "This victim shows signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration over an extended period. At least 2 weeks, possibly 3. And look here." She pointed to several bones. "These fractures are perimortem, happened around the time of death. She was beating herself against the walls toward the end." The fourth body came from the attic, sealed in a false wall behind the chimney. This one was the oldest, possibly from the 1890s based on the remnants of clothing. The cavity was the smallest yet, barely large enough for the woman to stand. The positioning of the skeleton suggested she'd died standing up, pressed against the bricks, her skull tilted back as if searching for air that wasn't there. 4 victims, Sarah said, standing in the incident room they'd set up in the Phu Ben town hall. The walls were covered with photographs, timeline charts, building permits, and family records. Spanning at least 50 years, all women, all sealed alive into the walls of the Halloway house. "All wives," Park added, pointing to the genealogical chart they'd assembled. "We've been cross-referencing with marriage licenses and death certificates. Every one of these women was married to a Halloway man." The pattern was horrifying in its consistency. Each victim had disappeared after a period of documented marital trouble. Neighbors' statements from old police reports mentioned terrible fights and violent arguments. In every case, there had been construction work done on the house shortly before or after the disappearance. New walls built, old rooms renovated, basements expanded. And in every case, the Halloway husband had reported his wife either as a runaway or a suicide. The bodies were never found, Because nobody knew to look inside the house itself. Sarah pulled up the marriage records on her laptop. Thomas Halloway married Elizabeth Porter in 1889. She disappeared in 1891. Death certificate lists cause as presumed suicide by drowning. Body never recovered. That's our attic victim, Park confirmed. The oldest one. Right. Thomas remarried in 1893 to Margaret Chen, no relation to me. She lasted 4 years before disappearing in 1897, listed as abandoned family. The basement victim, Dr. Solis said, checking her notes, based on the deterioration patterns and depth of burial. Sarah continued reading. Thomas's son, Robert Halloway, married Alice Thompson in 1926, missing in 1928. Death certificate says suicide, no body found. The bedroom wall, Park said grimly. Then we have Henry Halloway, Robert's son. Married Dorothy Campbell in 1940. She's listed as missing in 1942, presumed to have run away with another man. No evidence, just Henry's testimony. The dining room, Sarah said, with the diary. That's 4. Park looked at the chart. But the house has been in the Halloway family for over 100 years. There was a 5th generation. Sarah nodded, pulling up another file. William Halloway, Henry's son. He married Carolyn Reeves in 1947. And here's where it gets interesting. Carolyn didn't disappear. Everyone in the room looked at her. She left him, Sarah continued. Filed for divorce in 1950, citing physical abuse and fears for her life. The divorce went through. She moved to New Hampshire, remarried, had kids. She died in 2003. She got out, Park breathed. She's the one who got away. Which means there might be a living witness, Sarah said. Carolyn had 2 daughters, both still alive. One lives in Portland, Maine, the other is in Boston. Park was already reaching for his phone. Get me their numbers. We need to talk to them now. If their mother knew anything about this family, about the house. Within 2 hours, Detective Park was on a video call with Jennifer Matthews, the younger daughter of Carolyn Reeves. Jennifer was 68, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a tense expression as she listened to Park explain why he was calling. My mother never talked about her first marriage, Jennifer said slowly. Never. The few times we asked as kids, she'd just say it was a dark time in her life, and she didn't want to revisit it. Did she ever mention the house? Park pressed gently. The Halloway house on Maple Street? Jennifer's face went pale. Once, she said. Just once. Near the end. She had dementia by then. Kept confusing past and present. One night I was sitting with her and she grabbed my hand really tight and said, "The walls have ears, Jenny. The walls have mouths, but they can't scream." I thought it was just the confusion, the disease. But her eyes were so clear in that moment, so terrified. Did she say anything else? She said, "I heard them. At night I heard them crying. He told me it was the wind. But the wind doesn't sob like that. The wind doesn't call for help." Jennifer's voice broke. She said, "I ran before he could put me in there too." The room went silent. "Mrs. Matthews," Park said carefully, "did your mother ever tell you what she heard? Who was crying?" She said it was the other wives, the ones who didn't run fast enough." Jennifer wiped her eyes. "I thought she was hallucinating, but she wasn't, was she? Oh God, she was telling the truth." After the call ended, Sarah stood and walked to the evidence board. She pinned up a photo of Carolyn Reeves, young and smiling in her wedding dress, next to the photos of the 4 skeletal remains. "She heard them dying," Sarah said quietly. "She was living in that house while those women were sealed in the walls, and she heard them screaming. And William knew she heard them," Park added. "That's why she ran. She realized she was next. But why?" One of the junior officers fresh out of the academy spoke up. "Why would anyone do this? Serial killers usually have a pattern, a reason, even if it's sick. But this, spanning generations, different men all doing the same thing." Park walked to the genealogical chart. "That's what we need to figure out. This isn't just one killer. This is 4 generations of Halloway men, all murdering their wives in the exact same way. That's not coincidence, that's tradition. The answer came from an unexpected source, a trunk in the attic. It had been hidden behind a false panel, the kind of compartment that might go unnoticed during a normal investigation. But this wasn't a normal investigation. The forensic team was taking apart every inch of the Halloway house, and when they pulled back the old wallboard near the attic stairs, they found it. A leather trunk, locked with a corroded padlock that broke apart at the first touch. Inside were journals, dozens of them, dating back to 1872. The earliest was written in German, the handwriting precise and methodical. Later volumes switched to English, though the same careful script remained. They were all written by Halloway men, passed down from father to son like a treasured heirloom. Sarah sat in the incident room with a translator for the German entries, reading through the founder's words, while Park looked over her shoulder. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1872. "I have purchased the land on Maple Street as father instructed. The house will be built according to the old ways, with walls thick enough to hold the family's honor. Grandfather's wisdom must not die with our departure from the old country. Here in America, we will preserve what the modern world seeks to destroy." "Old ways," Sarah muttered. "What old ways?" The translator, Professor Haupt from the State University, looked troubled. "Keep reading," he said quietly. The entries continued, detailing the construction of the house, the specific thickness of certain walls, the careful planning of preservation spaces in the basement, bedroom, and attic. And then, in an entry dated November 2nd, 1889, "My wife Elizabeth has proven herself unfit. She questions my authority, defies my instructions, poisons our home with her independence. I have given her many chances to reform herself, but she persists in her rebellion. Father prepared me for this. Tonight I will preserve the family honor as grandfather did, and his father before him. The wall in the attic has been prepared. Elizabeth will learn that a wife's defiance ends only one way." Sarah felt sick. "He's talking about it like it's normal, like it's just what you do." Professor Haupt nodded grimly. "There's a tradition in certain parts of rural Germany, going back to medieval times. Die Einmauerung, the immurement, when a woman was considered to have brought shame to her family. When divorce would damage the family's standing, sometimes they would—" He paused, searching for words. "They would seal her away, alive, inside the family home, as both punishment and warning." "But that's medieval," Park protested. "We're talking about the 1800s, 1900s, modern times." "Some families," Professor Haupt said carefully, "maintained very old traditions, especially families that emigrated to preserve their way of life. They saw the modern world as corrupting, dangerous. They held on to the old customs even harder, even the darkest ones." Sarah continued reading. The next journal was written by Thomas's son Robert in 1926, right after his marriage to Alice Thompson. "Father has educated me well. I understand now the sacred duty of maintaining family honor. My wife must be molded into a proper woman, obedient and respectful. Should she fail, I know what must be done. The bedroom wall awaits. Father says the suffering is necessary, that without it, the lesson has no meaning. The house must witness their submission or their elimination." Each journal was the same. Henry writing about Dorothy in 1940, William writing about Carolyn in 1947. Every entry clinical, emotionless, describing the sealing of their wives into the walls as if discussing the weather. But it was the oldest journal, the one written in German, that contained the most chilling revelation. Buried in an entry from 1873, Sarah found this passage. "Today I received Father's final letter before his death. He reminds me that we are the last of the true blood, the keepers of the old justice. He says that back in Württemberg, our family was known for maintaining order through 12 generations. 12 women were preserved in the walls of our ancestral home before we left for America. He makes me swear that I will continue the tradition here, that I will teach my sons, and they will teach theirs. The family honor depends on our willingness to do what weak men cannot. 12? Park's voice was hollow. 12 women in Germany. And then they came here and started again, Sarah said. We've found 4 in this house. Carolyn escaped, so she would have been the 5th. That's 5 generations, 5 women. But the journal says this tradition goes back 12 generations in Germany. Dr. Solis, who'd been quietly reviewing the forensic reports, spoke up. We need to check something. The building permits show this house was remodeled 3 times. Major renovations in 1890, 1920, and 1940. Each time new walls were added, thick walls that served no structural purpose. Each time, right after a woman disappeared, Park finished. Sarah stood and walked to the blueprint of the house they'd pinned to the wall. We've checked the basement, the bedroom, the dining room, and the attic. Those are the 4 bodies we've found, but look. She traced her finger along the blueprint. There are 3 other sections with walls that are architecturally unusual. Here, in the library. Here, behind the kitchen. And here, in what used to be a sitting room on the 2nd floor. You think there are more, Park said. I think we've only found the beginning. The excavation of the library wall began the next morning. The forensic team worked carefully, knowing they might find another victim, another story of suffering sealed in brick and silence. When the wall came down, they found the cavity immediately, but it was empty, not empty like nothing had been there, empty like something had been removed. The interior of the space was clean, scrubbed down to bare brick, but there were marks. Deep scratches in the mortar, stains that luminol tests confirmed were blood, old blood, probably decades old. Someone was here, Dr. Solis confirmed, but the remains were removed, probably years ago. The kitchen wall told the same story, another empty cavity, another cleaned-out tomb. Someone had known about these bodies and had moved them. It was the sitting room wall that broke the pattern. When the team finally penetrated that wall, they found not 1 cavity, but 2. Side by side, separated only by a thin partition of brick, and both were occupied. The first skeleton was positioned like the others, curled in eternal agony, but the second was different. This victim had been placed standing up, arms raised above her head, wrists bound together with rotted rope. The cavity was so narrow she couldn't have moved, couldn't have sat or even shifted her weight. She died on her feet, trapped in a coffin of brick that forced her to stand until her legs gave out, until exhaustion and dehydration and suffocation finally claimed her. Why 2? Sarah asked, staring at the grotesque tableau. Why seal 2 women in the same wall? Dr. Solis examined the remains carefully. Different ages, she said. This one, she indicated the standing skeleton, based on bone density and teeth. I'd say she was in her 60s, maybe 70s when she died. The other one is younger, maybe 30. Mother and daughter, Park suggested. Or mother-in-law and wife, Sarah said, the horrible logic clicking into place. The journals mention maintaining family honor. What if it wasn't just wives who were sealed away? What if any woman in the family who caused problems, who knew too much, who threatened to expose the tradition? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment, the case files spread across her kitchen table, reading through the journals again. The clinical descriptions of suffering, the matter-of-fact planning of murders, the careful preservation of this horrible tradition across generations. And then she found it, an entry she'd skimmed past before, written by William Halloway in 1949. Carolyn has fled. Mother says I should have acted sooner, should have prepared the wall before she grew suspicious. But Mother was always soft, always fearful. She questions whether we should continue the old ways in this new American time. She forgets that tradition is what defines us. Without it, we are nothing. I have made a decision. When my son is born, I will teach him properly, and Mother will learn that even she is not exempt from the family's justice if she threatens to break our sacred trust." Sarah's hands shook as she called Park. "I found it," she said when he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "The empty cavities. I know where those bodies went." "Where?" "They weren't removed," Sarah said. "They were moved, resealed. William's mother, Helen Halloway. She disappeared in 1951. Death certificate says she died of a heart attack at home, body cremated immediately per her wishes. No autopsy, no witnesses except William himself." "You think he sealed his own mother in the wall?" Park's voice was fully awake now, sharp with understanding. "And his aunt, his father's sister, she vanished in 1953. No death certificate, no missing person report, just gone. The family claims she moved to Florida, but there's no record of her anywhere after that year." "The two in the sitting room," Park breathed. "William cleaned out the old tombs and created new ones. Probably to hide the evidence, to make the house seem normal if anyone ever searched it. But he couldn't help himself. He had to continue the tradition. His mother questioned it, threatened to expose him, so she became another victim. And his aunt must have known too much. The next day, the forensic team confirmed it. Dental records, when cross-referenced with old photographs, proved that the two skeletons in the sitting room were Helen Halloway and her sister-in-law, Patricia Halloway. Both had died in the early 50s, right after Carolyn escaped. "William panicked," Sarah explained to the team. "Carolyn ran, filed for divorce, and probably told people about the house, about what she'd heard. Nobody believed her or took her seriously, but William knew the risk was growing, so he sealed away the two women most likely to corroborate her story." "And then?" Park asked. "And then he stopped," Sarah said. "Look at the records. William never remarried. He lived alone in that house for 40 more years until he died in 1992. The tradition ended with him." "Why?" one of the investigators asked. "If this was so important to the family, why stop?" Dr. Solis had the answer. "William had no children. Carolyn left before they had any kids. The tradition was patrilineal, passed from father to son. When William died alone and childless, there was no one left to teach. The cycle finally broke." Sarah looked at the evidence board, at the photos of all the victims they'd identified. Elizabeth, Margaret, Alice, Dorothy, Helen, Patricia, and the dozens more in Germany they'd never find, never name, never give justice to. "6, she said quietly. 6 women in this house, plus the 12 in Germany, 18 victims that we know of. Probably more we'll never discover." The room fell silent, the weight of that number settling over everyone like a shroud. The excavation took 3 months. Every wall in the Halloway house was examined, tested, documented. In the end, they found 8 cavities total, 6 with remains, 2 that had been emptied and cleaned. But something else happened during those 3 months, something that the investigators didn't include in their official reports, but talked about in quiet conversations over coffee, in hushed phone calls to family members, in the private journals some of them kept to process the horror they were witnessing. The house started to feel different. Mike Torres, who'd found that first body and stayed on as a consultant to help the forensic team navigate the structure, was the first to notice it. He was working late one evening, helping document the removal of a section of wall in the second-floor hallway when he heard it. A sound like crying, faint and distant, coming from somewhere above him. He climbed to the 3rd floor, following the sound, but it seemed to move, always just out of reach. When he stood still and listened carefully, he realized it wasn't crying at all. It was the sound of someone breathing, harsh and labored, the kind of breathing you do when you're terrified and trying to stay quiet. Just the house settling, he told himself. But his hands were shaking when he packed up his tools and left early that night. Sarah heard it too. She was alone in the master bedroom, reviewing the photographs of the cavity where Alice Thompson had died, when she heard a scratching sound. Fingernails on brick. She froze, listening. The scratching continued, rhythmic and desperate, coming from the wall right next to her. The wall they'd already opened. The wall that was now just a hollow space with no one inside. She pulled out her flashlight and examined the cavity carefully. Nothing. No animals, no logical source for the sound. But when she turned off her light and stood in the darkness, she heard it again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of someone trying to claw their way out. Other members of the team reported similar experiences. Detective Park heard whispers in the dining room, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably human. Dr. Solis saw a figure standing in the corner of the basement, there for just a moment, a woman in a rotted white dress, before the shadows swallowed her again. They didn't talk about it openly, not at first. Each of them thought they were losing their grip, that the horror of the case was getting to them. But eventually, in the third month of excavation, Sarah brought it up during a team meeting. "Has anyone else experienced unusual things in the house?" The room went silent. Then, slowly, hands started to rise. Mike, Park, Dr. Solis, 3 of the forensic techs, even the young officer who'd asked about motives. "I see her sometimes," the officer said quietly. "In the windows upstairs, when I'm pulling up to the house, just for a second. A woman looking down at me. But when I go up there, there's nobody. I hear my name," one of the techs admitted. "Called out, really soft, like someone's trying to get my attention, but they can't speak too loud." Mike nodded. "The breathing. Every night when I'm working late, I hear someone breathing. Heavy, like they're suffocating." "The scratching," Sarah said. "Always the scratching." They looked at each other, these professionals who'd spent their careers dealing with death and evidence and logic, now forced to confront something that had no logical explanation. "It's the house," Park said finally. "That sounds insane, I know, but we've all felt it. This place is wrong. It absorbed what happened here, all that pain, all that suffering." Professor Haupt, who'd been brought back to help translate more of the German journals, spoke up. In the old countries, they believed that violent death could imprint on a place, that suffering left scars on the world itself. The tradition of immurement was considered especially cursed because the victims died so slowly, with so much terror. Their final moments were drawn out over days, sometimes weeks, all that agony concentrated in such a small space. "You're saying the house is haunted," one of the skeptical forensic techs said flatly. "I'm saying," Professor Haupt replied carefully, "that we're excavating what is essentially a mass grave built into the architecture of a residential home. We're pulling apart tombs where women died in possibly the most psychologically torturous way imaginable. Whatever your beliefs about the supernatural, you have to admit there's a psychological weight to that. Whether it's actual ghosts or just our minds reacting to the horror of what we're discovering, does it really matter? We're all feeling something." The investigation continued, but the team started working in pairs. Nobody alone in the house after dark. The sounds persisted, the glimpses of figures in corners, the overwhelming sense, especially in the rooms where bodies had been found, that they were not alone. Mike had the worst experience. He was in the attic late one afternoon, helping remove the last section of wall near where Elizabeth Porter had been found. The sun was setting, long shadows creeping across the floorboards. He heard footsteps behind him, clear and distinct, the sound of someone walking across the wooden floor. He spun around, nothing, but the footsteps continued, moving toward him now. He could hear the boards creaking with each step. Closer, closer. He backed up against the wall, his heart pounding, watching the empty air advance toward him. Then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Ice cold, the fingers pressing into his flesh with desperate strength. He shouted, stumbling forward, and the presence was gone. But when he looked back at the wall he'd been standing against, he saw something that made his blood freeze. handprints. Small, delicate handprints in the dust that covered the wall. Not old prints, fresh ones. Still, slowly fading as he watched. He left the attic and didn't go back. Sarah had her own moment of truth in the dining room, standing in front of the cavity where Dorothy Campbell had spent her final weeks. She'd been reading Dorothy's diary again, those heartbreaking entries that detailed every desperate day of her captivity. On impulse, Sarah spoke to the empty room. "Dorothy, if you're here, if any part of you is still here, I want you to know we found you. We know what happened. The truth won't stay buried anymore." For a moment, nothing. Then very softly Sarah heard a voice. Just one word, barely a whisper, but clear enough that she couldn't doubt she'd heard it. "Thank you." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. She didn't know if she believed in ghosts, in spirits, in any kind of afterlife, but she knew with absolute certainty that something in this house had heard her. Something had responded. The formal investigation wrapped up in late November. The house was officially declared a crime scene in perpetuity, to be demolished once all evidence had been catalogued. The Halloway family property was seized by the state. Plans were made to create a memorial on the site, dedicated to the victims whose names they'd recovered and the countless others whose identities remained unknown. On the last day before the demolition crews arrived, Sarah stood outside the house one final time. The sun was setting, painting the old Victorian in shades of gold and shadow. For just a moment, she thought she saw figures in the windows, 6 of them, maybe more, standing together and looking out at the world they'd been stolen from. Then the sun dipped below the horizon, and the windows went dark. The Halloway house came down on a cold December morning. The demolition crew had been briefed on the history, on what they were taking apart. They worked respectfully, carefully, as if they understood they weren't just demolishing a building, but dismantling a tomb. It took 3 days to reduce the house to rubble. As each wall came down, the excavation team watched carefully, still half expecting to find another cavity, another victim they'd missed, but there were no more surprises. The house had given up all its dead. The story of the Halloway murders became national news. Major publications ran features about the House of Horrors, the immurement murders, the Halloway family tomb. Documentaries were produced. True crime podcasts devoted dozens of episodes to analyzing every detail. But for the people of Pugbend, it wasn't entertainment. It was a reckoning. How had this happened in their town? How had 5 generations of Halloway men murdered their wives, sealed them in walls, reported them as runaways or suicides, and nobody ever questioned it? How had the screams gone unheard for over a century? The answers were uncomfortable. Neighbors admitted they'd heard raised voices from the Halloway house over the years, seen bruises on wives, watched women become more withdrawn and frightened. But they hadn't intervened. That wasn't how things were done. Marriages were private. Family business stayed in the family. "We knew," said Ethel Morrison, an 86-year-old lifelong Pugbend resident, in an interview with the local newspaper. "Maybe we didn't know they were being killed, but we knew they were suffering, and we did nothing. We told ourselves it wasn't our place. God forgive us." The memorial was unveiled on a rainy spring day 6 months after the house came down. It stood on the empty lot where the Halloway mansion had loomed for over a century. A simple granite monument engraved with the names of the victims they'd identified: Elizabeth Porter Halloway, 1869-1891, Margaret Chen Halloway, 1872-1897, Alice Thompson Halloway, 1904-1928, Dorothy Campbell Halloway, 1918-1942, Helen Weiss Halloway, 1895-1951, Patricia Morgan Halloway, 1897-1953, and below their names a simple inscription: "For these 6 women and the countless others whose names we will never know, may their suffering be remembered, may their silence finally end." The memorial became a gathering place. Women from across the country came to pay their respects, to leave flowers, to whisper their own stories of abuse and escape. Domestic violence organizations used the Halloway case as a rallying cry. a stark reminder of what happens when society looks away from suffering. Sarah Chen stood at the memorial on the anniversary of its dedication, reading the names carved in stone. She'd left the police force, taken a job with a national domestic violence prevention organization. The case had changed her, made her understand that law enforcement was only part of the answer. Prevention, education, breaking the cycles of abuse before they could claim another generation of victims, that was the real work. Detective Park retired shortly after the investigation concluded. He'd spent 40 years in law enforcement, seen hundreds of murders, but the Halloway case was different. It haunted him in ways none of the others had. He spent his retirement volunteering at a crisis hotline, talking to people in danger, trying to be the intervention that nobody had been for Elizabeth, Margaret, Alice, Dorothy, Helen, and Patricia. Mike Torres couldn't bring himself to work in historic restoration anymore. Every old house now looked suspicious to him, every thick wall hiding potential horrors. He retrained as a code inspector, focusing on making sure modern homes were built to modern standards, with no hidden spaces, no places for secrets to be sealed away. Dr. Solis continued her work as a medical examiner, but she became an expert on historical cold cases involving missing women. How many Alice Thompsons were out there, she wondered, women reported as runaways who'd actually been murdered? How many families had their own dark traditions, their own ways of making inconvenient women disappear? The forensic team published a landmark paper on architectural analysis in cold cases, using the Halloway house as a case study. It changed how investigators approached historic properties with suspicious disappearances. Houses across the country were re-examined with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, and sometimes, horribly, they found something. A farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania yielded 2 bodies in a sealed root cellar. A mansion in Virginia had a woman's remains in a bricked-over fireplace. An apartment building in Chicago revealed a victim in a false wall between 2 units. The Halloway case had opened a door to a hidden history of domestic violence, sealed away behind plaster and lies. But perhaps the most important legacy came from Jennifer Matthews, Carolyn Reeves's daughter. She wrote a book about her mother's escape titled The Woman Who Ran. It became a bestseller, a story about survival and courage, about recognizing danger and choosing life even when it meant leaving everything behind. In the book's final chapter, Jennifer included excerpts from her mother's private journals, recovered after her death. One entry, written just after Carolyn's escape, read, "I hear them sometimes, in my dreams. The other wives, the ones who didn't run, they're calling to me from inside those walls, begging me to tell someone, to save them, but I was too scared. I ran to save myself and I left them there, and I'll carry that guilt until I die. If anyone ever reads this, please know, if you're in danger, run. Don't wait for him to change. Don't hope it will get better. Don't tell yourself it could be worse. If something in your gut says you're not safe, listen to it. Because those walls are real, maybe not literally, but they exist. And once you're sealed inside them, once you let fear and hope trap you there, it's so much harder to break free." The book saved lives. Women in abusive relationships read Carolyn's story and found the courage to leave. Helpline numbers were printed in every copy. Support resources were listed in the appendix. Jennifer donated all proceeds to domestic violence shelters. What this case teaches us about the psychology of inherited violence is clear. Abuse doesn't exist in a vacuum. The Halloway men were taught to see their wives as property, taught that male authority justified any cruelty, taught that tradition mattered more than human life. They learned from their fathers, who learned from their fathers, creating a chain of violence that seemed unbreakable, but it did break. When William Halloway died without passing on his poisonous legacy, the cycle ended. That's the terrible truth about abuse. It thrives when it's normalized, when it's kept secret, when it's framed as tradition or discipline or just the way things are. The moment we drag it into the light, name it for what it is, refuse to let it hide behind closed doors and thick walls, we begin to break its power. The lot where the Halloway house stood remains empty, except for the memorial. The town voted to keep it that way, a permanent reminder of what happened when people looked away. On quiet evenings, some residents claim they still hear sounds from the empty lot. Not crying or scratching or breathing, but something softer, something that sounds almost like singing, like women's voices finally free to speak, to be heard, to exist without fear. Nobody in Pooh Bend talks about building on that land. It's sacred ground now, bought with suffering, dedicated to remembrance. And maybe, if you believe in such things, it's still occupied. Not by horror, but by resilience, not by the men who tried to silence these women, but by the women themselves, finally able to tell their stories, finally released from their walls. Sarah visits the memorial every year on the anniversary of Mike's discovery. She leaves 6 roses, 1 for each named victim. And sometimes, on particularly still days, she swears she feels something like gratitude in the air, like the women are acknowledging her presence, thanking her for refusing to let their suffering be forgotten. The Halloway case closed officially in June. All victims identified or memorialized, all evidence catalogued, the property demolished. The journals sealed in the state archives with restricted access, their contents too disturbing for casual reading, but preserved for future researchers, future investigators, future generations who need to understand how darkness can persist when good people choose silence. But for Sarah, for Park, for Mike and Dr. Solis, and everyone who worked the case, it will never really close. They carry those women with them. Elizabeth and Margaret and Alice and Dorothy and Helen and Patricia and all the unnamed others, the 12 in Germany, the countless victims of immurement throughout history, whose screams were never heard, whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was sealed away and forgotten, until now. The truth about the Halloway family is out there now, preserved in court documents and memorial stone, in the DNA records that finally gave the victims back their names, in the photographs of those sealed cavities that show exactly how narrow the spaces were, how impossible escape would have been, how prolonged the suffering must have felt. The house is gone, but the story remains. And that's exactly as it should be. Because forgetting these women, letting their stories fade back into silence, would be another kind of murder. The Halloway men tried to erase their wives from existence, tried to make it as if they'd never been, never mattered, never had voices worth hearing. They failed. Those voices echo now, not just in Pooh Bend, but across the country, across the world. Every time someone reads about the case, learns the victims' names, understands what happened in that house of horrors, those women are remembered. Their suffering means something. Their deaths demand something from us. Vigilance, compassion, the courage to intervene when we see someone in danger, the refusal to let tradition or privacy or fear keep us silent when silence enables violence. The walls came down. The secrets were exposed. The dead were honored. And in the end, though it came far too late, justice of a kind was served. Not for the Halloway men who died unpunished, who never faced consequences for their crimes, but for their victims, who are finally heard. The wind blows across the empty lot on Maple Street, rustling the flowers people leave at the memorial, whispering through the grass that grows where the house once stood. And if you listen very carefully, on certain nights when the air is still and the town is quiet, you might hear something in that wind, not crying, not screaming, not the desperate sounds of women dying in darkness, but something else, something that sounds like relief, like release, like 6 women and all the others they represent, finally free to rest. That's what happened in the Halloway house. That's what we uncovered when we broke through those walls. Not just bones and evidence, not just the facts of murder, but the truth about what happens when we value tradition over life, authority over compassion, silence over justice. We found the victims. We gave them back their names. We told their stories. And we promised, all of us who worked that case, who witnessed what human beings are capable of doing to each other, who saw how suffering can be inherited and perpetuated across generations, we promised that we would never let anyone forget. The Halloway house is gone, but the women who died there, the women who suffered there, the women who were sealed alive in those walls and died in darkness and terror and desperate hope that someone, anyone, would hear them, they're remembered now, every single one, and they always will be. Now, I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but creating them takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos. I'm so grateful.